let's get some music playing as we continue our delve into Daggerheart. We're gonna go with. I want something. Oh, you know what? This seems pretty adventurous and maybe a little somber too. We'll see how this goes. Okay. I think it's a low part. If it's too loud, of course, let me know. Now, let's bring up our presentation windows here. This is primarily what we're going to be viewing. However, if it is necessary, I also have... Hey, look at that. I also do have right over here our character sheet. So if we need to play around in it, we can, as well as reference what means what in terms of the playtest packet to what we might expect to see. All right. For right now, we don't need this. We're going to close this out. Dingo, I will actually I will give a brief summary of my feelings thus far. Now, every one of you can download this. I am not sponsored. This is not. This is. I went to the Darrington Press website and I downloaded the playtest packet that anyone else can. This is the version 1.3. I haven't looked at or reviewed the prior beta tests of Daggerheart. So while they did do a good job here of putting in, well, this is what changed, etc., it doesn't mean anything to me, so we just went ahead into it. And in fact, we went over the overview and chapter 1 last night. We went over the example character, the domains that make a character, the classes and ancestries and communities. And now we are going to pick up here in chapter 2. So if you're playing along at home, open up your playtest packets to page 86 here, which is the beginning of chapter 2, Playing an Adventure. Now, as a quick review, this is, anything in here is subject to change. It is placeholder concepts and wording, hopefully more finalized than not. This is an extreme summary of things, right? My initial reaction is it's mixed and optimistic. There are aspects to it like using cards to accent your to determine what your character can do. That is special, for spells or other abilities. That was the initial souring of the concept to me. Now, I also said this in terms of I enjoyed 4th edition. I ran it, I played in it a little bit, though I'm a forever DM. However, going into this, eyes wide open, very optimistic. As soon as we're playing with accessory cards that you swap out in between rests and everything, I really started to go, I don't know about this. However, I would be doing this game a disservice without pushing forward. And, a couple other things were brought up. Hey, this is what you do if you play a cleric, even in 5th edition. Now, I'm not comparing this to D&D. I'm not comparing this to Alien RPG. I'm not comparing this to My Little Pony. I want to look at this system as it is. In the packet, it said what it wanted to do, and I hope that it will allow for it. The big speed bump was it hoped to make combat smooth. And as soon as it started bringing in accessories and cards and swapping stuff out like that for everyone, not just playing a cleric or a druid in 5e, I really was getting into hem-haw territory. And overall, the way that this is assembled is a high fantasy, a golden horizon, you are the big damn heroes. And that is not said with any negativity. Now, there are systems that accentuate that, where it's almost baked in. In fact, even D&D is that, the horizon is silver or gold. You will be, this powerful big damn hero of the land. You start as the son of the farmer out in the countryside, and then you're overthrowing God by the end, right? The feelings that I was getting from this is Daggerheart wants to present itself as this kind of a system. And it gave, I use the term plastic, not necessarily in a negative light, but everything just kind of has like a shine to it. Everything feels like a shiny game. And it was Link's Awakening. If any of you played the new Link's Awakening on the Switch, which is a remake of initially on the Game Boy, how everything in that game is bright and shiny and everything sparkles and has like a shine to it. That's a sensory description of what I've picked up from this so far. Nothing about it has been... you know what? I have the character sheet for version 1.2. I wonder if anything changed for the character sheet for 1.3. I just noticed that. I'll have to double check just in case, because I don't want to lead anyone astray. I just noticed this, but it does say 1.2. I'll take a look, because there is something in the playtest material. Anyway, there's verbiage in here in the playtest, which what is the term? It is audience. It is parlance for the modern audience, modern sensibilities. I'm not saying that as that's anything that's bad or good, but this is certainly written with modernity in mind. Iron Chef Lord, howdy to you. And I think that's the grand summary. The things that I've picked up from how it is being presented right now, and most, all of this could change before the official release. Anyway, let's get back to it. We are in Chapter 2, Playing an Adventure. And we'll continue reading, discussing. You can ask questions. If you read the prior versions, you want to bring things up, or if you have a question, I'll try and answer it. But this is my first reading. I've gone into this without any prior knowledge. And let's see how things continue to play out. I want to keep an open mind about this. Anyway, Playing an Adventure. In this chapter, we'll cover what you need to know as a player in order to start your adventure. This includes the core mechanics, how combat works, some optional rules to consider adding to your game, and more. In a session of Daggerheart, the players go back and forth describing what their characters do in the fictional circumstances the GM lays out for them, building on each other's ideas and working together to tell an exciting story. The mechanics of the game help to mediate this conversation, providing structure to the discussion and a way to resolve moments where it's unclear what will happen next. One of the most important aspects of this conversation is asking questions. In Daggerheart, this should go both ways. The players will often ask clarifying questions about the scene. Are there any guards outside the door? Or do you think I can jump across the gap safely? Or what kind of weapon are they holding? Now, for some of you out there watching now here live on Twitch or later when it goes up on YouTube, this, like almost every other system, does cover things that are probably already familiar to you. Because someone who's never played a role-playing game, this could be their first. So some of this might be redundant. There are parts that I might skip over if it sounds very redundant-y to us exploring the actual system and not just the introductory language. So if I skip over something or if I sound like I'm abbreviating, that's me moving through a little bit of that hand-holding or onboarding for super brand new players. But the GM should also ask questions of the players and build upon those answers to create the fiction. How do you sneak around this building so carefully? Or what does the camp you've set up here look like? Or you found a way to scramble up the wall safely. What was here that made it easier than you anticipated? This back and forth allows for a collaborative conversation where everyone has a chance to contribute to the fiction in a meaningful way. For those familiar with role-playing games, the flow of the game is probably something that comes second nature by now. But for those new to this kind of experience, it may not. There we go. I beat the book to beating me to the book. Below is a basic look at the procedure of play, the gameplay loop that drives every session. 1. The GM narrates details. 2. The players and GM ask questions. By the way, if you want me to go back up and refer back to something, please, hey, can you go back over that? Just because I'm scrolling past something doesn't mean it's fallen off, the clearly demarked edge of the flat world we live on. And it can never come up again. I'm happy to go back and look at things. Or especially if I did skip over something that could have been important, or I got ahead of myself, I stumbled into my words, and I may have read something, but it came out with different words than what was written. So players and GM ask questions. Players and GM answer questions, choose and resolve actions, repeat the cycle. This is pretty bread and butter for about any TTRPG that you may have played before. So we have an example interaction. This section covers the core mechanics of Daggerheart and how to utilize them as a player at the table. Additionally, the equipment section near the end of this chapter presents rules on weapons and armor, and the previous chapter contains rules for using your domain cards, class, subclass, ancestry, and community. On your turn, the game has no turns in the traditional sense. Players don't have a set amount of actions they can take or things they can do before play passes to someone else. In most scenes, everyone should follow the fiction to figure out what happens next, bouncing around the table to whoever it makes sense to spotlight in the moment. Whenever you decide to do something in the story and the spotlight shifts to you, your PC makes a move, which you describe to the group. These moves can include talking to another character, interacting with your environment using a class feature, and most anything else you can dream of. Some moves automatically succeed. It's easy to open an unlocked door, while others require a roll to determine the outcome. It's hard to break down a barricaded door. Any move that requires a roll is an action. A few other moves also state they are actions, though they don't require a roll. When you make an action, play pauses while you make an action to roll an action roll to determine how things play out. And if you're in combat or otherwise using the action tracker, you'll also place an action token on the tracker. If a move says to use an action, but you're not using the action tracker right now, you can still make that move. You only have to pay attention to which moves are actions when you're using the tracker. Since Daggerheart relies on a flexible back-and-forth conversation between the GM and players, combat has no initiative order, no rounds, and no distinct number of actions you can take on your turn. Instead, fights play out narratively, moment to moment, just like non-combat scenes. This provides the players opportunities to team up together in their tactics, respond appropriately to narrative changes in the scene, and not be locked into violence once the first strike happens. In combat scenarios that have the potential to last more than a few rolls, or in any scene where movement-to-movement gameplay becomes important to track, you can use the action tracker to track each PC action. This provides structure for these scenes without compromising flexibility. GM moves and adversary actions. PCs aren't the only ones who make moves. The GM can make a GM move at nearly any time. Most commonly when a PC rolls with fear or fails an action roll. GM moves typically escalate the scene in an exciting and dangerous way. A PC might take an attack from some enemies, become vulnerable, or anything else that significantly changes the scene. This creates a back and forth conversation as the story evolves organically between the GM and players. Hi, Jacance. Good to see you. Thank you for joining us. Many GM moves don't require spending any resources, but the GM spends action tokens to activate adversaries in battle. And they spend fear to make more powerful moves, like using an adversary or environment's fear move. Then we have our Duality dice. The core dice in Daggerheart are a pair of D12 dice called Duality dice. These D12s are different colors, or if you prefer, different sizes or patterns, one representing hope and the other representing fear. Each player chooses 2 colors of dice that embody these concepts for them, using them anytime they make an action roll during the game. Your Duality dice don't need to be the same 2 colors as anyone else's around the table, but they do need to be easily recognizable from each other at a glance. The Duality dice represent the way the world pushes the character back or guides them forward throughout the story. Regardless of whether you succeed or fail on an action roll, your Duality roll will influence how the scene evolves. I will have to take your word at that, Dingo. If you want to go into more detail about that, please do. But I don't have experience in those systems. Though I did equate last night when we were going into this, the way that when a player generates fear, how that becomes a resource for the GM to use. I did equate that to the panache system in the D10, because I have experience playing in the D10 7th C game. And when you would spend your panache in order to do something, the GM got that panache to then use against you at some future point in time. So all the players had this ability to push something a little bit harder, but then that would let the storyteller, the GM, pool that extra push to be used at a later point in time. It was a fun management system. And also, hi GMV. Rolling hope and fear. Hope and fear represent the duality of the world beyond the characters and how the world around them impacts the action they're attempting. One of your Duality dice is your hope die and the other is your fear die. When you roll your Duality dice and the hope die rolls higher than the fear die, you roll with hope. When this happens on an action roll, mark one of the hope slots on your character sheet up to a maximum of 6. You might also gain hope from spells, abilities, or other things that happen in the game. Fear. When you roll your Duality dice and the fear die rolls higher than the hope die, you roll with fear. When this happens on an action roll, even if you succeed, there are consequences or complications that come from it. Critical successes. Whenever you make a Duality roll, if both dice roll the same number, you automatically roll a critical success, even if you would have otherwise failed because the total is lower than your roll's difficulty. Not only does a critical success on an action roll count as a roll with hope, but you also clear a stress. Once you've gained hope and recorded it on your character sheet, you can spend it to power special abilities, erasing it from your character sheet when you do. Your hope carries over between sessions, but you can only hold up to 6 hope at any given time, so you don't want to save it for too long. Hope can be used in several ways: to help an ally, utilize an experience, or activate a hope feature. You can spend 1 hope to help an ally who is about to make an action roll, where you could feasibly aid them. When you do this, describe how you're helping and roll your hope die. This doesn't count as an action for you. Your ally then chooses which of the 2 hope die results count toward the roll. The other one is ignored. Only one PC can contribute an extra hope die in this way. Utilize an experience. You can spend a hope to utilize one of your relevant experiences on an action roll. adding its modifier to the dice results. If more than one experience could apply, you can spend an additional hope for each experience you want to add to your result. Like inspiration, Dingo. Yeah. A concept similar to that, or the hero point in Pathfinder. And of course, there's other mechanics too. In Dark Heresy, there was fate that you could burn in order to affect things as well. Did I read? Utilize an experience. You can spend a hope to utilize one of your relevant experiences on an action roll, adding its modifier to the dice results. If more than one experience could apply, you can spend an additional hope for each experience you want to add to your result. Activate a hope feature. Spells and abilities may also allow or require you spend hope to activate certain effects. A hope feature is any effect that asks you to spend hope to activate it. If the text instructs you to spend hope, that means you must immediately spend the specified number of hope, or you can't trigger the hope feature. When using a hope feature, if you already rolled with hope as the higher duality die for that action, you can just spend the hope from that die instead of erasing a hope from your character sheet. Otherwise, you'll need to spend hope you've stored from earlier rolls to activate the effect. Unless an effect states otherwise, you can't spend hope multiple times on the same feature to increase or repeat its effects. For example, if a feature says you can spend a hope to add 1d6 to the damage roll, you can't spend 2 hope and add 2d6 instead. Tip: some effects only trigger on a success with hope. This doesn't mean you can spend hope on a successful roll with fear to get the effect. It instead means the effect only takes place when you roll with hope and you succeed on your action roll. On this kind of effect, you don't have to spend hope to activate it. It just happens as long as the conditions of the roll are met. And what about fear? As a player, rolling with fear doesn't mean your action roll failed, but you'll face some type of complication. For example, you might only learn partial information, face a strike from the enemy you just attacked, or encounter an unexpected danger. If you also failed on the action roll where you rolled fear, you'll instead face major consequences or complications. When you roll with fear, you don't record it on your character sheet. Instead, the GM either can make a move, generally to reflect the complications of your fear roll, or they can collect a fear to store for later. The GM can spend stored fear to make a move later, such as by powering adversary and environment moves. Evasion score. And if we come over... I don't know if anything has changed in the 1.3 character sheet, but as a heads up, I just realized this is the 1.2. If not much has changed, then you can see that you do have evasion up here on the character sheet, and you'll see that this is pretty spread out and open. That's because it seems like there's a card system for your actions. So you're holding a hand of cards that have things that will empower you as well. And that it asks that you use tokens to measure stuff out. Maybe if you don't want to, erase a bunch of things and mark a bunch of things over and over again, you can use tokens to track things on your sheet. Let's put this away. Your evasion score represents your ability to avoid attacks and other unwanted effects from adversaries. This score sets the difficulty for any roll another creature makes against you. Your base evasion score is determined by your class, but it can be modified by domain cards, gear, statuses, and more. You get to describe what your evasion score represents. Take this opportunity to be creative, evocative, and deepen your character. You might be good at acrobatic dodging or precise footwork. You might parry incoming blows. You might disrupt enemy attacks with well-timed counters, or you might have magical shields or enchanted objects that ward off blows. Similarly, when an adversary misses you with an attack or another effect... Oh, man. The bots have been out in force. You know what? All last night, we kept getting double tapped by bots that would come in 2 at a time with their messages. So real quick, everyone, I need you... well, it's been happening. So what I need you to do, if you want, you can you can copy the message, click on the name of, we'll start with Tim here, then click on the 3 vertical dots, hit report. Then spam, scams, or bots. I'll hit bots. And then I'll put it something like soliciting chat to go to a channel enhancement website. And then I will Control V. I'll paste what the message said. And then we hit submit report. And I'm going to do this one more time real quick. Also for the second. But yeah, the bots have been hitting back to back. And if we don't take a moment, out of our time here to report these, then they will just go on to harass other channels. And we are the hero zone. We are not going to let this pass. We will take action right now to report these bots. Yep, Ravenstar, we're getting hit 2 at a time by bots again. So, there we go. And, let's continue. We're not going to let bots ruin our time together. All right, Raven. If you wish to lurk in the shadows and wait, I'm sure we'll get another hit by them. Yep, report plus block. Thank you, Dingo. Let's see. This was evasion. While these descriptions add to your character and to the story your group is telling together, they don't change the normal evasion rules or give you special bonuses. For example, you might describe how you use a powerful burst of magic to redirect an arrow headed your way, but this doesn't mean you can redirect the arrow back at the enemy who fired it and deal them the damage instead. Hit points and damage thresholds. Hit points represent the physical injuries and discomforts experienced by your character during your adventures. Your available hit points, sometimes called HP, are determined by your class. When you take damage, usually when an adversary succeeds on an attack roll against your evasion score, you mark between 1 and 3 hit points, representing that you've lost that much health. The number of hit points you mark is determined by your class's damage thresholds. As a first-level character, you'll usually mark at least 1 hit point on your character sheet each time you take damage. As you gain levels, you'll become more resilient. The dark bars in the hit points and stress section of your character sheet show the 3 tiers of damage you can take: severe, major, and minor. For example, a level 1 Guardian starts with the following thresholds and hit points. So we have 1, 9, and 18, and we have 6 hit points. When the GM tells you to take damage, compare that number to your thresholds and mark hit points depending on the tier. Severe damage marks 3 hit points. Major damage marks 2 hit points. Minor damage marks 1 hit point. Damage below your minor threshold marks no hit points. If you ever mark your final available hit point, you must immediately make a death move. Example, in the image above, a Guardian's incoming damage is severe if it's 18 or higher, and they mark 3 hit points. If the damage is 9 or higher, but below 18, the damage is major, and they mark 2 hit points. If the damage is 1 or higher, but below 9, the damage is minor, and they mark 1 hit point. If the damage is below 1, they don't take any hit points. Anytime you make downtime moves, you have the opportunity to clear some of your hit points. Additionally, as you level up your character, you'll be able to permanently increase both your damage thresholds and your number of hit point slots, making your character more resilient against incoming attacks. To make the game more dangerous, the table may implement a massive threshold that's double your severe threshold. If you ever take massive damage, you mark an additional hit point. And stress points. Stress points represent the mental and physical strain put on your character during their adventures. Some effects require you to mark a stress point. Additionally, you can sometimes choose to mark stress points, or a stress point, to affect the narrative. When you do, consider the burden your character knowingly accepts. Does your anxiety increase as you use a new tactic in a high-stakes negotiation? Do you accept the impact of witnessing horrors in order to dive back into danger and save an innocent? Are you willing to take minor abrasions to fatally wound your foe? When an effect requires you to mark a stress point, do so on your character sheet. Whenever you mark your last stress, you become vulnerable until you either clear at least one stress or clear the vulnerable condition through other means. If you're ever forced to mark a stress point, but your slots are already full, you must instead mark a hit point. As with hit points, when you make downtime moves, you have the opportunity to clear some of your stress. Additionally, when you gain levels, you'll be able to increase the amount of stress you can withstand. Some adversary actions might require you to mark stress. These actions represent the adversary's ability to demoralize you, exhaust you, or similarly push your physical and mental limits. Your GM can inflict stress as the complication or consequence of an action, especially when a roll doesn't go as well as it could have. For example, you might mark stress as a complication from having a difficult conversation, clashing swords with a worthy foe, or committing an act of incredible bravery. You might be able to mark stress to perform certain moves that call for it. Unless an effect states otherwise, you can't mark stress multiple times on the same feature to increase or repeat its effects. For example, if an ability lets you mark a stress to add 1d8 to a damage roll, you can't mark 3 stress and add 3d8 instead. You can't use any moves that requires you to mark stress if you don't have slots to mark. In each scene, this is in action rolls now, in each scene, the GM and players go back and forth describing what happens. You make a move where the outcome is in question, and the success and failure of that move is interesting to the story. Your move is an action. In these cases, the GM usually calls for an action roll to determine how the movement unfolds. However, if an action would either be impossible to perform, or it's easy enough to pull off without complication, there's no need to roll. You already know the outcome. When the GM or spell, attack, or ability asks you to make an action roll, you'll do so by rolling your 2 duality dice. These 12-sided dice embody the way the world's chance, luck, and fate play a part in the story. Each action roll follows 4 basic steps, which are detailed later in this section. Step 1. Pick a character trait. Ask the GM what character trait best applies to the role, and they will set a difficulty for the role, openly or privately at their discretion, based on the details of the scene. Add extra dice modifiers. Decide if any experience or other modifiers also apply, and grab any character tokens, advantage, disadvantage dice, or other dice as needed. Step 3. Roll the dice. Roll your duality dice, any additional dice, and your character tokens. Total their result, telling the GM the total and which duality die rolled higher. I got a 15 with fear. Step 4. Resolve the situation. Work together to resolve the outcome of your actions. When the GM calls for an action roll, your character is usually already starting to act. Depending on the situation and how you've described what you're trying to do, the GM might tell you what character trait to use, or your action might require you to roll using a certain trait. Other times, the GM might ask you for more information to help decide, quote, you want to convince this guard to let you through. How are you speaking to them? Are you trying to intimidate them? To trick them? End quote. Sometimes more than one trait makes sense. In this case, the GM might ask you which trait fits best, give you a choice between two, or make a judgment call based on the situation at hand. As you tell him about the important message you have for the king, I need you to make a roll here to determine whether he can tell if you're lying or not. I'd say instinct is probably what best applies. Does that sound right to you? Unless your action requires a certain trait, feel free to suggest one and describe why it's a good match for what you're doing. However, the GM always has final say over which trait applies. Yeah, grabbing Selter by the horns is probably not a good idea. You could do it once. And then you get a special smooch from Selter. You grab the horns and she'll lean in and give you a very tingly kiss. When you decide to make an action roll, the GM typically... Alright, did I already... No, okay. Sets the difficulty. The number you need to reach when you roll. This number is based on the situation and how effective your approach might be. If you're making an action roll against an adversary, the difficulty is usually defined by their stat block. The GM can choose to share this number or keep it to themselves. Even if they don't tell you the difficulty, they should make any potential consequences of your actions clear, unless the consequences aren't something your character would reasonably be aware of. For example, quote, you're putting yourself in melee with this guy. You might take a hit in return, or if you fail this jump, you might not make it to the other side. Add extra dice and modifiers. Once you know which trait to use, it's time to figure out if any other dice or modifiers apply to the roll. Set aside any dice you need, such as the following. Your duality dice. You roll hope and fear die with every action roll. Advantage or disadvantage. If you have advantage or disadvantage on a roll, set aside an additional d12 to use on the roll as your additional hope die. And that was brought up earlier. Some class features allow you to add extra dice to your roll or allow another character to give you a die. For example, a bard can give you a rally die, which you can add to an action, reaction, or damage roll of your choice. Similarly, some of your subclass and domain cards might grant you a bonus die. Set these aside for your roll. Occasionally, other effects might give you an extra die. Then count the modifiers that apply to your action roll, setting aside that many character tokens to help you keep track. Modifiers can include the following. A chosen trait. Add the modifier for whichever trait you and your GM choose for this roll. Experience. If you have an experience or several you think applies to the situation, describe how your experience helps your chance of success. Then spend 1 hope per experience to add its modifier to your roll. The GM may ask you for more information to justify that experience, but you have final say within reason over whether your experience applies. Class features, subclass cards, and domain cards. Sometimes these grant you a modifier to your roll, so keep an eye out. Other bonuses or penalties. Add any other bonuses or penalties, such as from the GM, the items you have equipped, and other sources. If you consistently use the same experience on every roll, it's very likely the GM will require you to narrow the scope of your experience or change it altogether. The purpose of experience is to reflect the way your character has specialized in something important, not give you a bonus to all of your actions. Once you declare what modifiers you're applying to your action roll, grab that many character tokens. Tokens are never rolled for a random value. They are simply +1 counters you add to your hand to aid in counting your results. Before adding them to a roll, figure out the sum of all your modifiers, then take that many tokens. For example, if you have a -1 to agility and a +2 modifier from an experience you're utilizing, you have a +1 total modifier to the roll. So set aside 1 token to represent that. Occasionally your total modifier on a roll might be negative. In this case, you can still use the tokens, but remember they'll signify the number you need to subtract from the result, not add. Once you've gathered all your dice and tokens from step 2, roll them all at the same time, counting each token as 1. Add all your tokens and dice rolls together. But if you rolled with advantage or disadvantage, you don't count all 3 of the duality dice you rolled for that. Follow the instructions in the upcoming advantage and disadvantage section to determine which duality dice count. Then tell the GM the total number you rolled along with which duality die rolled higher. I rolled a 15 with fear. If you determined in the previous step that your roll has a negative modifier, be sure to subtract the tokens representing this, rather than adding them. Some features allow you or another player to add a bonus to your action rolls, damage rolls, or reaction rolls. Unless otherwise specified, all bonuses must be added before you make the roll. For example, if a bard gives you a rally die, you must choose to use it before you roll. Rather than, and by the way, this is a good time to point this out. Something like this, with the 2 commas, in the playtest, they said, look, you might find some sort of spelling or grammatical or spacing or some sort of error. These are not things to report because this has not gone through an editor yet. So if you find these, don't go, oh man, I thought Darrington Press was supposed to be perfect, blah blah. This was written out. It's it's a solid concept, but it's not refined. Things like this happen. And so if you're doing the playtest at home, they ask you do not report things like a double comma that we see here. It will be caught by an editor. It'll get smoothed out. And if it doesn't, well, you can't say that they didn't ask you not to do it, because they did ask you not to do it, and it still happened. Anyway, we're here. Rather than after you see the numbers for the other dice. A few features let you affect a roll after the result has been totaled, either by applying a bonus, like the Seraph's Prayer dice feature, or by allowing for a reroll. At the GM's discretion, you can generally use these after the GM has said whether a roll succeeded or failed, but you must do so before the narrative consequences unfold or another dice roll is made. Resolve the situation. Each time you make an action roll, the scene changes in some way. The GM always describes how the world reacts to the action that's been taken, but depending on what your action result is, the situation changes differently. If your total meets or exceeds the difficulty set by the GM, the action succeeds. You get what you want. If the total is below the difficulty, the action fails. You don't get what you want. but with one exception. As described in the Duality dice section, if your Duality dice both roll the same number, you've rolled a critical success, even if your total wasn't enough to meet the difficulty. Based on your roll total, the GM uses the following guide to decide how the narrative moves forward. On a critical success, you get what you want and a little extra. Take a hope and clear a stress. If you made an attack roll, you'll also deal extra damage equal to the maximum value of your damage dice. On a success with hope, you pull it off well and get what you want. Take a hope. On success with fear, you get what you want, but it comes with a cost or consequence. The GM can make a move or gain a fear. On a failure with hope, things don't go to plan. You probably don't get what you want, and there are consequences. You gain a hope, and the GM can make a move. On a failure with fear, things go very poorly. You probably don't get what you want, and there is a major consequence or complication because of it. The GM can make a move or gain a fear. After announcing your roll's result, always look to the GM to find out what happens next. In Daggerheart, every time you roll the dice, the scene changes in some way. There is no such thing as a roll where nothing happens, because the fiction should constantly be evolving based on the successes and failures of the characters. A failure doesn't mean you simply don't get what you want, especially if that would result in a moment of inaction. The game is more interesting when every action the players take yields an active outcome, something that changes the situation they're in. For example, if you fail a roll to pick a lock, it's not just that the door doesn't open. On a failure with hope, it might mean you can hear the rumble of footsteps coming down the hall behind you. The enemies you previously escaped are getting close, and you're going to have to act quickly to find a way through. On a failure with fear, the door might have been magically warded to keep thieves away, and its arcane alarm triggers. Meanwhile, on a success with fear, you might succeed in unlocking the door, but you're spotted by the enemies within. These consequences are what make the game interesting and drive forward the adventure you're all on together. Every GM and player has a different level of interest and comfort in this roll-by-roll improvisation. Some groups may prefer a largely predetermined world. For example, the GM could have previously decided there are 2 guards on patrol, and you roll simply to learn whether you unwittingly run into both of them, whether one rounds the corner but you catch them unawares, or whether you escape both guards without notice. In other groups, the GM might not have decided if any guards exist at all, but after you roll a failure with fear, the GM weaves 2 guards into the story you're creating together. Either approach is okay, and you'll likely use a mix of both in each session, but Daggerheart shines when each player feels free to affect a story that doesn't exist yet, rather than waiting for a predetermined story to unfold. Part of the game's fun is discovering those unplanned moments together. Example action roll. Sarah's rogue, Isabella, is trying to run across a narrow parapet to stop the mage that is raining spellfire down on her party. The GM tells Sarah to make an agility roll with a difficulty of 15. Isabella's agility is 2, so Sarah rolls the duality dice, adds them together, then adds 2 tokens, representing her +2 modifier from agility, to get her total. Here are examples of the 5 possible results of her roll. Sarah rolls 3 on the hope die and 6 on the fear die, +2 from agility for a result of 11 with fear. Deciding to make a move rather than take fear, the GM describes the mage responding quickly to Isabella's maneuver, making an attack roll. It is successful, so the mage knocks her off the parapet with a blast of magical fire and deals damage. She crashes down to the level below and must find a way back up if she plans to face the mage head-on again. Failure with hope. Sarah rolls 6 on the hope die and 3 on the fear die, plus 2 from agility. That's an 11 with hope. 11 isn't enough to make it across safely, so on a failure, the GM makes a move, narrating that the mage sees Isabella coming and makes an attack, which succeeds. The mage's blast knocks Isabella off balance, leaving her dangling from the parapet, her progress stalled and position precarious. Isabella gains a hope, but her friends are still in the line of fire and may need to help Isabella reach safely. Success with fear. Sarah rolls a 5 on the hope die and a 9 on the fear die, plus 2 from agility. That's a 16 with fear, a success. The GM asks Sarah to describe how she races across the parapet, dodging the mage's blasts. After her description, the GM decides to make a move rather than take fear, saying that once Isabella has crossed, she faces her foe head-on, blocking them from attacking the rest of the party. But then the mage reaches out with magic and crumbles the parapet behind Isabella, leaving her trapped and unable to move back to safety. At least the mage isn't attacking her friends, right? Success with hope. Sarah rolls 10 on the hope die and 6 on the fear die, plus 2 from agility. That's an 18 with hope, a success. She immediately gains a hope. Then the GM asks her to describe what it looks like as Isabella races across the parapet and interrupts the mage's assault on the party. Since Sarah rolled a success with hope, the GM asks what the players want to do next. Critical success. Sarah rolls 8 on the hope die and 8 on the fear die. That's a critical success. Isabella immediately gains a hope and clears a stress. The GM offers Sarah a choice of 2 extras. She can deal damage to the mage or gain advantage on the next roll against the mage. Sarah describes how Isabella races across the parapet and lands a telling blow on the mage, not just stopping their attacks on the party, but dealing her weapon damage as well. Since a critical success counts as a roll with hope, the GM asks the players what they want to do next. Many action rolls just use the above rules. However, some situations require special types of action rolls. These use the following rules. Trait rolls. A trait roll is an action roll that specifically calls for a certain character trait to be used. These rolls often appear on domain cards and say something like presence roll or agility roll 12. If there is a number in parentheses after the trait, that is the difficulty you must meet in order to succeed. If there is no number, the difficulty is up to the GM to decide. Though a trait roll requires you to roll using that trait modifier, you can still add your experience and other bonuses to the roll. When you make an action roll with the intent to do harm to an enemy, you're making an attack roll. Reference the weapon or spell you're using for the attack to determine what trait it uses. We'll talk more about spellcast rolls in the next section, but for a standard physical or magic weapon attack, use the character trait the weapon requires, as well as any experience or other modifiers that are applicable, and resolve it as you would a normal action roll. If you succeed, make a damage roll to determine how much harm you do to the target. By default, each attack roll can only target one enemy, but if a spell or ability allows you to target multiple enemies, roll once and apply that result to all enemies the attack can hit. If the roll meets or exceeds the difficulty of any of those enemies, the attack is successful against that target, but not necessarily against other targets. It makes sense. When making an attack without a weapon, for example, a punch or kick, make an attack roll as usual. This attack often uses strength or finesse, but could be any trait depending on how you describe the attack. On a success, your damage dice are a number of d4s equal to half your proficiency rounded up. All unarmed attacks deal physical damage. Spellcast rolls are a type of action roll that's used when you're creating significant magical effects, often via a domain card. These are called, these are called, okay, yeah, I see this. These are called for like this: spellcast roll or spellcast roll 14 in parentheses. Instead of referring to a specific stat on a character sheet, these rolls use the spellcast stat of your class, which you can find on the subclass foundation card. As with trait rolls, if there is a number in parentheses, that is the difficulty they must pass in order for it to succeed. If a spellcast roll is intended to damage a target, it's also considered an attack roll. You generally need to be using a specific spell to make a spellcast roll. You can't just make up magic effects like forming a bridge out of vines that aren't on your character sheet or cards. However, at the GM's discretion, they might allow you to creatively apply an existing spell in an unusual way. And you can always flavor your magic to match the kind of character you're playing, but that flavor shouldn't give you access to effects you wouldn't normally be able to perform with your spells. Example 1. If a sorcerer is trying to reach a cliff high above him and doesn't have a spell or ability that gets him there, he wouldn't be able to just make a generic spellcast roll to have magic lift him up into the air and fly him to the cliff. He would need a specific spell or ability that would provide him that kind of magic. Example 2, if a wizard wants their rune circle spell they just picked up at level 3 to erupt from their wand in sparks, form into a galloping flaming stallion that circles them, and this is the reason why Rune Circle gives them protection from enemies, that's awesome and should be highly encouraged. But if they wanted it to do extra damage to an enemy because of this narration, that wouldn't normally be permitted. Anytime you cast a spell, the text tells you when the effect expires. It might be temporary, in which case the GM can spend the move to end the spell. Can expend their move to end the spell. And the next short or long rest, etc. If the spell doesn't note an expiration, it stays up until you choose to end it. If you ever want to end a spell earlier than when it would normally expire, you can always choose to do so. If you ever want to make a spellcast roll, but you don't have a foundation that gives you the needed spellcast ability, you won't be able to make the roll. We'll finish this section, and then I need to refill my drink, and we'll come back in the review with damage. But let's look over group action rolls. When multiple PCs are taking an action together, such as sneaking through the enemy camp, the group nominates a leader of the action. Then each player describes how they collaborate with other PCs on the task. The action's leader makes an action roll as usual, while the other PCs make a reaction roll using whichever traits they and the GM decide fit best. The leader's action roll gains a +1 bonus for each reaction roll that succeeds, and they gain a -1 penalty for each reaction roll that fails. If the action tracker is in use, each PC who participates in a group roll adds a token to the tracker, even those who make a reaction roll instead of an action roll. If you want to assist an ally on a roll, use Help an Ally instead, and that's in its own section. Example, a party has just retrieved a stolen amulet from an ancient stronghold and are rushing out as it crashes down around them. The GM calls for a group action roll as they all try to escape. They elect the ranger to be the leader, since that character would remember the path the best. The other party members explain how they work with the others to escape. The guardian says they are going to use their size to shield the others from the falling debris, so the GM has them make a strength reaction roll. They get a 14, a success, giving the ranger a +1 modifier. The GM asks the guardian to describe how they shield their friends. The rogue says they are running alongside the ranger to act as a second set of eyes, in case there is a faster route. The GM has them make an instinct reaction roll. It's a 19, also a success. so they give the ranger an additional +1 modifier. The GM asks the rogue to describe what quicker path they notice that helps. The wizard says that they notice the stronghold begin to fall once the amulet was taken, so they try to understand what kind of magic caused the collapse and reverse it. The GM has them make a knowledge reaction roll. It's a 12, not quite enough, giving the ranger a -1 modifier. They ask the wizard what happens as they are studying the amulet that causes them to drop behind for a moment. The bard says that they notice the wizard is looking like they're not going to make it and turn back out to reach a hand in a moment of desperation, yelling, "I've got you! We're not leaving you behind!" The GM has them make a presence reaction roll. It's a 16, a success, giving the ranger an additional +1 modifier. The GM asks the bard and the wizard to describe how this rescue happens successfully. Now that everybody else has reacted, the ranger takes the total of the modifiers, in this case +2, and makes an agility roll, hoping to lead the party to safety while dodging debris and pointing out hazards. It's a 16 with fear. The GM says they all take a point of stress, but they also emerge from the stronghold just in the nick of time, the ancient stones collapsing around them. And tag team rolls. Each player can choose 1 time per session to spend 3 hope and initiate a tag team roll with another PC. When you do, work with your chosen partner to describe how your 2 characters combine their actions in a unique and exciting way. Both you and your partner make separate action rolls, but before resolving the roll's outcome, choose one of the rolls to apply for both of your results. If the chosen roll is with hope, the PC whose action roll was chosen gains that hope. If the action tracker is active, tag team rolls only take 1 action token instead of 2. Tag team rolls become especially powerful on attack rolls. On a successful tag team attack, you both roll damage as usual, then add it together to determine the damage dealt. Hi, Mage. All right, we're going to leave off here on page 98 in the Daggerheart version 1.3 rules. We'll come back after a quick stretch and a sip break. I'm going to refill my beverage here. Actually, I think I'm going to swap over to a root beer. So, stretch, snack, sip, do what you got to do, and we'll come back and continue our exploration of the Daggerheart playtest in just a moment, everyone.